In this video, I will teach you 18 tactical patterns. And it is really important if you want to improve and you don't want to miss out on brilliant moves during your own games that you watch this video from the beginning until the end. You don't skip around, you try to think along and you try to solve every single exercise with me. Because if you don't, you will literally be missing out on brilliant moves in your own games. We are going to start off with our first tactic here. And this is a tactic which will use a pin. So you are probably already familiar with the pin. Here we are looking at a pin on a pawn, meaning that this pawn, even though it looks like it is protecting the the b3 pawn, it's not really protecting it because it can't move. So this opens up some tactical opportunities. We can take this with the queen, with a check. The enemy king only has one square and then we can deliver a checkmate. That was a really easy example, but I will always show you an easy example first, and then we are going to try and solve a difficult puzzle. So here we have a more difficult puzzle where we also are able to use a pin. So if we take a look at this, you might at first sight not notice anything that's going on. What I am looking at here is the fact that I have this bishop and this rook, which I can use to try and do some tricks. The first thing is, whenever we move our bishop or rook, will always be attacking the enemy rook. So that is what I am thinking about. Is there a square where I can move this bishop so I can activate my rook and set up an attack? And there actually is a square. And that square is moving the bishop to d4. And simply because if white captures our rook, of course we can take this, that's a check, and then we will also be able to recapture the rook. So we will just be up a full piece. Of course, we also have to calculate what can happen if white plays something like rook to e1 and they just try to protect their bishop. And now we have a really beautiful use of a pin as well. And that is to play the amazing move rook to c1. And what rook to c1 does is basically set up the same tactic again. That if white takes this, we can take with a check, and then wherever the king goes, we will be able to capture the rook. So really try to remember this pattern as well, because you will find this in your own games a lot of the time. Next up, we are going to take a look at the skewer, which is basically a reverse spin, meaning that we are going to attack a very high value piece. Oftentimes that is the king, and then we will try to capture what is behind it. So whenever the king is lined up with another important piece, usually the queen, you have to think, is there a way I can attack the king, force it to step out of the way, so I can capture the queen? So here what we would actually like to do is to play our rook to c7, or maybe put our queen somewhere here on c7 or b7 so we can have a check, and then we can try to attack this queen as well. So here one of the best moves to start off with is the check with the queen on b5. And in general, whenever you are trying to find the best move in the position, always looking at checks and captures is the right start. So that is why we could start here with the queen to b5 check. The enemy king has to move, so there are a couple of options. I am going to play the king here to e7, and then you can see we now have this plan that we saw a little bit earlier with the rook to c7. We are attacking the king. It doesn't matter if the bishop blocks because we can just take it, and then we can take the queen. Of course, the king can also go somewhere else, but if the king goes here, they are also losing the bishop with check. If the king goes here, we can do multiple things. We can actually go in with the knight as well, give a check, force them to step in front of the queen, and then still do this skewer. So this was an easy example of how the skewer works. Now we have a little bit more of a difficult example here. So white is trying to attack the black king, and we already have our queen pretty close to the enemy king, because these squares are already all in our control. Also, this pawn is helping us to control this square. So basically the enemy king is trapped. If we can bring in another attacker, we would be able to go for a checkmate. We only have one remaining piece, so the options are not so big. We basically have to play with this bishop. So bishop to c5 is of course a very good move, because this will help us to just play a checkmate with the queen on the next move. The only way really to stop this from the black side is to play rook to e5, just because this gives the king a square that they can move to. But we can continue with the plan, give the check, the king has to move, and now you should see the skewer that we can do. We can attack the king, force it to move, and then capture the queen. And we can do that by playing queen to g8. The king has to go, and then we can capture the queen. So that was the skewer pattern. Next up, probably something you have already seen a lot, which is the fork pattern. Basically meaning we are going to move one piece and attack two pieces at the same time. If one of those pieces is the king, that's even better, because the king will always be forced to move, or they will have to do something like block your check, and then here we can take the rook. Okay, in this position white can recapture, but it doesn't matter because in the end we still have the extra bishop and we can also prevent white here from going for the promotion. But sometimes it's not so easy to spot. So for example here we have another fork we can do, but it is way more complicated. So we are going to take a look at what we can do. In general, we can see the enemy king is here, the queen is here. Usually those are the most important targets of your attack. So can we do something? We also have our queen pretty close by. Our queen is already cutting off some squares again, but our queen is also under attack. So especially since our queen is under attack, and also our king is actually not super safe here as well, we have to look for the most forcing moves. So we have to try and find checks and captures. So that is what we want to do first. Well, we can always capture the rook with the queen or capture this bishop with the queen, but it will never really do much because, well, we are always going to be losing some material. You might be thinking maybe about sacrificing the queen here because we actually do have a check and then also a discovered attack with the rook on the queen. But for example, in a line like this, at the end of the variation, we didn't really gain much and it is still black who has a superior position. So that is not our solution. We also have another check which we can do, which is knight to d5. And this is an incredible move because knight to d5 is a check. It also attacks this knight. And you might be thinking, wow, we are just giving away the knight for free. But it also opened up our rook. So now we can participate with the rook as well. And we can do a rook fork, attacking the king and the queen at the same time with a rook, giving a check. And in the end, we will get this variation in which we have one material. If you calculated that black can take with the knight, that's also true. But we can still take with the rook or with the queen, give a check, for example this, and then we have multiple follow-up tactics as well. And black will always lose even more material. For example, here they will also lose the knight. The next pattern we are going to take a look at is a discovered attack. So a discovered attack basically happens when you have a piece, you move that piece, and because of that, a new piece becomes available and attacks one of your opponent pieces. So that is pretty similar to what we have seen in the previous exercise, where we can move the knight, and then we can do a discovery with the rook. Usually you have positions like that, and you can already see a similar theme here, where we have the knight and the queen. Also, this is lined up with the enemy king, so you can already start feeling that there are tactics in the air. We have to think about the most important moves being captures and checks. And we have one move here, which is both a capture and a check, and that is knight takes d3, and this is also a fork. We are attacking the king and the rook at the same time. And if you look at it from this point, you would think that, well, this is not going to be possible because the bishop will be able to recapture. But as soon as I play this, I hope you notice that this queen is pinning the enemy bishop. So the bishop actually can't recapture. So we have this discovery and we also have a fork. Here there are multiple moves, but the best move for black is not to take the rook. Because, well, if we take this, white's probably going to try to move the bishop, for example, bishop to g6. And then in the end, they might also win back this knight. The best thing we can do is just take this bishop, protect our knight, and also attack this bishop. Here we have a more difficult example where we are going to try to set up a discovered attack. So what are we looking at? Well, first of all, the black position is completely destroyed. The queen is already here. Our king is not super safe, but at the same time, we are not in immediate problems. We still have some time to try and do some counter attack. What I want to do is always focus on how can we make a really big impact with our moves. So how can we win the game or win a queen or win a lot of material. So the first thing I am thinking of is that this queen in our position is annoying, but I can always attack it with my rook because our position has been destroyed anyway, so it doesn't matter too much. If we attack this with the rook, the queen has to move. And there are not that many options. Probably the queen is going to go to h6. But this also puts the rook on the same rank as, on the same file, I have to say, as the enemy king. And this also creates a pin, being that this pawn is now pinned to the enemy king. So it's no longer protecting this one, and it's also no longer protecting this square on f3. So we can actually play something like knight to f3 check, because the pawn cannot capture us. And here you can see why it's really important to follow along and try to solve these one by one and understand them one by one, because we are always going to use the tactics that we know and even more complex tactics as well. So the king has to move. There is only one move, of course, because we have a check and we're also covering this square with the knight. So the king has to go here. And then we have the move queen to d3 and we capture this bishop. The reason why we can do this is because we did a discovered attack. we moved the knight and we opened up the queen on this bishop. So we are not going to go for a checkmate, we are going to go for this. And you might be thinking, well, aren't we just dropping our knight? Yes, but that would be a rather easy checkmate. We can actually take here and then do a checkmate, or we can of course also take this and then do a checkmate. Next up is the double check. So the double check is a discovered attack which involves an attack on the king. And the piece that we are moving to create the discovery is also going to give a check. Usually this happens a lot with the queen and the knight working together. So the queen is on the diagonal with the enemy king, which means that if we move our knight wherever we want to move it, we will always be giving a check with our queen. But if we can move the knight in a way that it also gives check to the enemy king, we will have a double check. And a double check is extremely powerful, because whenever you give check, your opponent can either capture your piece, block, or move the king. But when we give a double check, for example knight takes d5, well, they can't block the check because they would be captured by the knight, and they can't capture our knight because otherwise the king would be lost to the queen. So whenever you give a double check, your opponent is forced to move. And if black goes here, this is a pretty easy checkmate in one. The queen gives a checkmate and she is protected by the knight. So yeah, black has to go here and then everything is going to collapse and black is going to lose a lot of material in this line. Here we have a more difficult example of the double check. And we are going to try to set up a double check. So again, we are trying to find a solution to this problem. We are going to focus on captures and checks. That's all I care about for now. So the most interesting moves for me are right now maybe taking this with the queen, because then we are getting closer to a checkmate. Maybe capturing this with the knight or going in closer with the knight because we want to try and go for a checkmate. But I can already tell if I move my knight, I will never have something extremely well. There's no immediate threat, and also my queen will just be traded and I will be losing material here as well on the c file. What is the most interesting move? It is the move that is both a check and a capture. And that is rook takes g7. Rook takes g7 check. The king has, of course, the option to either capture us or move, but if they move, it's also pretty bad. And actually, if they move to h8 to the corner, we have this checkmate now, because our queen and our rook are also working together. So I'm going to say the enemy king captures us, and now we can pull off the double check. Knight to f5. And of course, the king is on the diagonal for the bishop. The knight moves, the knight also gives a check. So there's only one option. Black can't block, they can't take our knight, they have to move the king. And now we are going to use this queen h6. And here you can also see that if you calculate all of the captures and the checks, even if you don't use them immediately, for example the queen h6, we didn't go for it immediately, it's going to appear in our tactic anyways. And that's why it's really important to calculate those types of moves. So the enemy king has to move, and then we can take this queen. And of course, if they go to g8, we have another very simple checkmate. Next up is the X-ray attack. And with the X-ray attack, we are basically attacking a square through an enemy piece. So we can see the enemy king is on the back rank. That always means there are opportunities for back rank tricks or back rank checkmates. Our queen is already looking at the back rank. And then the question is, do we have another piece that is also looking at the back rank? And the answer is yes. Our rook is also looking at the back rank. Even though there is another piece in between, the rook is also with an X-ray vision looking through this rook at this back rank square. So we have a pretty simple back rank checkmate here with queen d8 check, and the only options for black are of course blocking with either the bishop or the rook, but then we just have queen takes with a check, and now you can see how our rook was actually helping as well with this back rank trick, and we have a simple back rank checkmate. This is a more difficult example, so we are going to try to solve this as well, and this combines a couple of ideas we have already seen. So the enemy king looks very safe. It's just castled and the rook is there as well. Everything looks fine, but it's not fine. White is going to win with a checkmate in 5 moves. So what can we do? As always, we are going to capture the checks, the captures. So I am thinking about maybe playing knight here with a check, but I don't really see a lot of purpose because, well, yeah, black can always capture this. There are some things we can try afterwards as well. This move is not immediately losing, but for example, if I play this, and they take here, we can maybe recapture the bishop, but the calculation ends there and I don't really see a trick. We can also, of course, sacrifice the queen on f7, and black doesn't have many options, of course, because this is going to lead to a back rank checkmate, again basically with an X-ray attack from the rook as well. And if they take our rook, now we have something really beautiful. Rook to the back rank, check. Black has to block, and now you can already see something we have seen before. We can do a beautiful double check. We can do a double check with our knight to e7, check with the knight, also check with the bishop, meaning the king can only move to h8, and we can do checkmate with this rook or with that rook. It doesn't really matter. Next up, we have deflection. So with deflection, we are trying to draw away an enemy piece from doing an important job. Right now, we really are attacking black. We are attacking this g7 pawn 3 times with our 2 rooks and with our queen. But black still has 3 defenders of this pawn, so we are not really going anywhere. So we are going to try and lure away a defender. And we can simply do that here by exchanging rooks. If we take on f2, well, if black doesn't recapture, they are immediately behind in material. So basically, black has to capture. And then we can play rook takes g7 check. And this is again a problem for black, because if they take us, we are capturing their queen for free, because this rook is also being deflected. It's being forced to move to g7. You could also think, well, maybe they can also move the king, but if they move the king, for example, this is a checkmate. And if they move the king to this square, we also have this check. The enemy king has to go here. And let me think here. I think queen c7 should be an easy win as well. Here we have a more difficult example of a deflection. This is also one you can sometimes use in the endgame. So the position seems very equal. We have the same amount of pawns, but we would like to force a promotion. And it is black to move. If we just capture here, white's going to recapture and everything is very symmetrical and we are going to get a simple draw endgame. But we have a beautiful move here. Pawn to a3. And we are basically giving away this pawn for free. But of course, if black takes it, we are going to have a queen on the next move. So probably white is going to take here, because white can't take here on b4. What we are going to do is just capture this. And maybe it's not immediately clear to you, but this is winning. Because we are going to have some king dance, the kings are going to move. And in the end, we will reach a position like this. And white will at some point have to move. And then we are just going to be able to promote to a queen. Now we are going to take a look at attraction. Now we are going to try to attract the enemy piece onto a square. So this is in a way similar to deflection. With deflection, we are usually trying to draw away a defender. With attraction, we are usually trying to attract the king or the queen to a square where they will be vulnerable for attack. So what we are trying to do in this position is we actually want to promote to a queen. But that wouldn't be so great because, well, there is rook h1 and then there is here a simple back rank rook checkmate by black. So we want to promote, but we can't promote. It would be nice if we could promote and also give a check to the enemy king. So we are just going to force black to put their king there. We're going to play rook to h8. Black has to capture this, and then we can promote to the queen. And now we can take the knight. And if the knight is gone, of course, this entire tactic by black doesn't work because we can just capture the rook. So this is the attraction pattern. There are also more difficult examples of attraction, especially this one is a really nice example because black has so many pieces surrounding the king, but still white is going to win this quite easily if you find the winning plan. So there are a couple of things to calculate. We always want to take a look at checks and captures, so you could think about exchanging queens, but without the queens we are not really going to have anything going for us. You could also think about this back rank check, but the king is pretty much safe, there's not much going on. Or we have a move that is both a capture and a check, so it's probably a good move, capturing here on f7 with the bishop. The queen takes back, and then we are going to play pawn to e6. And this is another example of a fork. We are going to fork with the pawn, basically meaning we are going to attack 2 pieces at the same time. Black has to move one of them, and then we can take the other, and this is also with a check. So black recaptures, but still, if you look at this, black still has an extra bishop and a knight, so we have to keep up the attack. I am looking at checks and captures, so the most interesting move is activating here with the rook and giving a check. Because you could also think about giving a check with this rook, and that would actually also be winning. After, for example, king goes to f7, and now we give the check with the queen. The king has to go here, and then we activate the rook. It's basically the same pattern, but activating pieces that were not participating in the attack is especially useful. Knight to e7, then we can take, and now we can play rook to g8, queen to f8, and finally rook to f8 checkmate. And this was a pretty long and difficult pattern, but even if you can't calculate this to the end, it's not really a problem. As long as you keep looking for checks, captures, and especially those moves that are both a check and a capture, If you just calculate those, and even if you just start playing them out, you will most of the time reach a winning position. Next up, we have the clearance, or also known as the clearance sacrifice, which basically means we want to open up a file diagonal or square for another piece. So what can we do here? The king and queen are lined up on the same file. There is no pawn here as well, which means that if I could put my rook here, that would be a pretty good move. That would probably be the best move in the position. Even if I could capture my own piece, and then I could pin this queen and I would win material. But my knight is here, so it's pretty simple. All I have to do is clear up this square. I have to move my knight, for example, taking this, and then I can just simply play rook to g4, pinning the queen, and you could get a position like this, which is winning. Next up, a little bit more difficult example of a clearance sacrifice. That is this position, but I think it's also very interesting. White to move, and we can already tell that if we don't do anything, probably black is gonna castle, or they might also start trading some pieces and then castle. And yeah, it's probably gonna be a draw or even a position that is better for black. But there is one line in which white wins. What we want to do is attack this king as much as possible, but right now the king is still very safe. Most interesting for us would be if we could go for some checks on the diagonal, maybe activate the queen, but we can't too much. And our rook is also blocking some of our own pieces. So we are simply gonna do the move that is both a capture and a check. Rook takes c8, the bishop captures, and now we are having some extra options. We can, for example, give a check with the bishop, but if we go for this, well, after black blocks us, yeah, there's not much going on. You could get something like this, but yeah, nothing much is happening here. So we basically just want to activate an extra piece. So I'm gonna play queen to c2, so I can activate the queen for the attack. Why do I play c2 and not queen to c1? Well, pretty simple. If we play the queen to c2, we are already thinking about the future, where we could potentially activate our rook as well here on c1, or maybe even attack this queen on a1. And otherwise I am blocking my own piece. White pretty much has to move the bishop, and now we have a pretty nice trick. That is rook to a1. And if you look at this, the queen is actually trapped. So the best move for black is just to go for this. And of course, white is now up material. Next up are back rank tricks. Back rank tricks are actually most of the time back rank checkmates or combinations of other tricks we have already seen. This one is, in my eyes, a X-ray attack, where again, the king is on the back rank, the pawns are blocking the escaping squares. We have the queen attacking this rook, but with the X-ray attack, we also have our rook attacking that rook. So we can play the beautiful combination queen takes c1, rook takes c1, rook takes c1, and the only thing for white to do is block the check, and then we can take, and that is a checkmate. But it's not always that easy. This is another example, and you might even think that there is no back rank tricks, because there is this square on f7 which is open for the enemy king, and they can always hide there. What we want to do is force the enemy king into the corner, because if we can put them in the corner, they are again stuck behind their own pawns, even if it's just two of them. So the right move here is to start off with queen to e1, because this forces the enemy king into the corner. If you would think about queen to e8, you would be losing because of this, and even though it looks nice with the checks, in the end, the king will be able to start running. And we don't want that. We want the enemy king stuck on the back rank, so we're going to force them there. And now things are pretty easy. This is just a basic back rank checkmate. Give check with the queen, and then a checkmate with the rook. Next up is the windmill, which is usually with a bishop and a rook. To set up a windmill, all you need to do is attack the pawn in front of the king with your rook and your bishop. That is also a pin, so the bishop can't capture us. And in this example, we are even playing a beautiful queen sacrifice. The enemy can take our queen, but we don't care because we have a windmill, and a windmill is most of the time worth way more than a queen. We can take on g7 with a check. The enemy king has to move, and here we can really see the windmill. And that is, we can move the rook, and this gives a check, and at the same time the rook also blocks all escaping squares. And then we can just repeat this pattern. And we can keep repeating this pattern, and black basically can't do anything. They are just forced to repeat this forever. And that means that we can eat up all of the pieces on the 7th rank, and once we are tired of that, we can also move the rook somewhere else, for example here, and then, okay, the king can now move, but we can also capture a queen for free. That is not the only windmill. There is also a more advanced windmill, which many players actually don't know, and that is this. And This is probably a really difficult one that you can't just see on the spot, but here we are going to do a windmill with a bishop and a knight. So we are going to set this up by playing queen takes e4, a brilliant move. We are sacrificing the queen for a knight. Pawn takes, and now we have a beautiful windmill. Check with the bishop. The king only has one square. Check with the knight. The king only has one square, and this is where we have the same windmill type tactic, where we can basically move the knight back and forth wherever we want, and we keep giving checks with the bishop, and we can basically eat up all of the pieces that are in on the squares that the knight can reach. Or here we can even set up a checkmate after remaneuvering a little bit, because the knight gives the check and also the enemy king can't go anywhere. Next up are not 8th rank tactics, not back rank tactics, but 7th rank tactics. That's also possible. And especially this g7 square is very weak for the 7th rank tactics. What we can do here is we can play rook to g7 with a check. Of course, it's this move. Why? It's a check and a capture, so it's the first move we have to calculate. Black can recapture, but then we just have queen to f7. Rook, the king goes to the corner, and now you should already see the same thing we have looked at before. Just a pretty simple back rank checkmate. But it's not always so easy. Sometimes it's not so clear to see what we have to do. But again, if we have a queen and a rook attacking this pawn in front of the enemy king, usually there will be some tactic there. And the first thing you always need to calculate is what happens if you sacrifice your rook. They will usually take with a piece because they can't take with the king. Otherwise, they would be losing the king. And going to the corner will most of the time also lead to some checkmate. And then it's always important to have some kind of backup piece you can also use. So here we can give a check with the rook. Blocking with the bishop is impossible because the bishop is pinned. So the king has to move. And then after a couple of checks, we get into a checkmate. So next up is the pawn wedge. The pawn wedge is basically when you have a pawn on g6 and this pawn is taking away 2 squares from the enemy king. So even though there are no pawns blocking the enemy king, they can't go anywhere because of our pawn. And the most incredible thing you can do in these positions is activating your queen. Because if you can activate your queen, for example, to h7, that would be a checkmate. So what we would like to do in this position is capture on h4 and then play the queen to h7. But we can't do that because the enemy queen is protecting. So we have to combine everything we have seen. We have to deflect the enemy queen from her defensive duties. So we have to attack her and also force her to move. And we can do that with the brilliant move rook to b8. Rook to b8 attacks the queen. The queen doesn't have many options, and if she takes us, we can just go with queen to h4. And then even if black tries to create some escaping squares, we can give a check. And also our knight is actually helping so that we have an entire rank that the enemy king cannot use. And then we can give a checkmate with the queen on h8. There are more difficult examples. For example, this one is a little bit different. We don't have the pawn here on g6. We have the pawn on h6. But it's the same idea. We just want to get one of our pawns as close to the enemy kingside position as we can. And that way we are here, instead of taking away those 2 squares, we are taking away this square, which is also an empty square. And now even though there is no pawn there, the king can also not go there. Of course, if our queen could jump over pieces, we would play queen to g7 and that would be a checkmate. We sadly can't do this, so we have to move the rook. The question is, where can we move the rook so that the queen opens up? Of course, we have a lot of options, but I always recommend taking a look at checks and captures first. So a move like rook to g8, g6, which is of course also a brilliant move, sacrificing the rook. There are 2 options. If black takes this, we have the simple checkmate. And if black takes this, we can't play this checkmate because the queen would capture us. So we have to be a little bit more creative. What can we do? Well, we have something very amazing. Queen h8, another brilliant move, sacrificing the queen. And then we just have a simple checkmate. Again, this is a back rank checkmate because even though there is no pawn here, our pawn is actually protecting this square. So that's another way you can use the pawn wedge to win. Next up are queen sacrifices. Queen sacrifices are not really, in my eyes, a team by itself, but it's usually a combination of other tactics. This one is especially nice because this is also a checkmating pattern. So the enemy king, again, looks pretty cozy, looks protected, but it's far from the truth. We already have our rook, our knight, and our queen lined up, so of course tactics are in the air. We have to calculate checks and captures. And that's basically what we have right now. If we take this with the rook, the enemy king can move to the corner, but that would not be so great. What white could just simply do is just take with the knight, and the king is actually pretty safe and we don't have much going on. You might think, well, we can play rook to g8, but there's no immediate checkmate in this position. Checking here with the knight also doesn't do much, the king can just run away. But what if we check here with the knight? The king can also run away. But this is a famous checkmating pattern that you might have not seen. And that is queen takes h2, sacrificing the queen. And this is also a back rank checkmate, because these ranks on the side of the board are also back ranks. There is one pawn here, and we also have two squares that are protected because our knight is attacking those. So we just simply have a back rank checkmate here. After they block with the queen, we have a checkmate. Here we have another one, but queen sacrifices are especially strong. Again, we are trying to look for tactics, so what we are calculating is mainly checks and captures. So I am already eyeing up this square because, yeah, that's both a check and a capture, and we have two pieces there. So most interesting, of course, is going to be, can we potentially play bishop takes f2? Check, the rook moves, and then we can sacrifice the queen. And even though this looks crazy, we are basically sacrificing the queen to also attract the enemy king to this square, so that we can do a combination of a pawn fork and then also win this queen. So just look at how incredible this is. First we have a bishop sacrifice, then we have a queen sacrifice, then we have a fork, which is also a discovered attack, and then after they take this, we take their queen. So that really shows why you have to know all of these themes, so that you can start combining them in even more difficult patterns. Next up, we have something which is probably a little bit more famous than the others. That is the Greek gift sacrifice, meaning sacrificing your bishops on h7. And this can often lead to pretty quick checkmates, because if the enemy king moves or if they capture you, it's basically misery in both variations. You can come in with a queen, give a check, come in with a knight, and that's basically checkmate. Sometimes they can try to give away pieces to prevent it for one more move, but in the end, usually you will still have a checkmate, or you will just win a bunch of material. Here we have another one, just to show you that the Greek gift is extremely powerful, even if you don't see it. And this is both a Greek gift and also a double bishop sacrifice, which is another tactic. Because we are going to play bishop takes h7, queen h5, but we don't have a knight. Usually you want to do this with a knight so that you can go for the checkmate. But we don't have a knight. Well, we still have other pieces. So we are just going to crash with the bishop on g7 and then give a check, give another check, and we can also use our rooks. So even if you don't have a knight, you can still pull off the Greek gift sacrifice. You just have to make sure to use all of your pieces and do some calculation. Next up is trapping pieces. So trapping pieces is basically attacking a piece, making sure it can't go anywhere so you can just win it. There are some pretty simple traps with trapping bishops or knights in the opening by attacking them with pawns, but of course the most interesting of traps is trapping the enemy queen. What I like to do for this is always, whenever the opponent's queen is in your camp, or is somewhere where she doesn't have that much space, is to start calculating squares. And if I take a look at this, I immediately see that the queen basically doesn't have much. All she has is this file which she can move on. So if I was able to play my rook here, that would basically be a queen trap. But I can't do that because my rook would be captured. So I have to make sure that I can protect this square, which is pretty simple. Bishop e3 check, and now of course this square is protected, so we can just play rook to a7, and the opponent has to sacrifice the queen. It's not always that easy, sometimes it's a little bit more complicated, but here you can also see the enemy queen really doesn't have many squares. Basically she can already not do anything except maybe give this check to us. So we have to make sure we play all of the most aggressive moves, and we are looking for checks and captures. Here we also have the double check, which we have already seen, which we can play by, I was going to say, playing the knight to f6, not the knight to f4, knight to f6. But after this double check, let's say the king goes here. If we calculate a little bit, there's actually nothing going on. You might think, well, maybe I want to move my rook, but yeah, you can't move the rook because it's pinned, so there's not much going on. We can also do this, which is a discovered attack, and this helps us cover the square for the rook. So again, we are covering the square first, then we are attacking the queen, and then we can force a trade. And this is already completely winning, plus we also have some simple checkmate trade as well. Next up, we have two more tactics we need to cover almost near the end. The first is interference. So what are we going to do here? Interference is when you try to block the connection between enemy pieces. So one very simple thing you could think about is, okay, I can capture the rook and then black captures with the queen. But is there a way we can prevent the queen from recapturing? The first thing you could think about is playing something like the pawn to b4, because this blocks the queen. But the queen can capture here, and if we capture the rook, well, we are also losing this bishop. Okay. Another option we have is playing the bishop to c3. This also attacks the queen. It's also a fork. And after the queen goes somewhere, for example, she grabs a free pawn, now we just simply win the rook. So that is the interference. We are trying to block the connection between enemy pieces. This is especially common in the opening phase when there are open diagonals and there are especially light squared weaknesses or dark squared weaknesses depending on which color you are playing, where you can attack with your bishop and your queen. So what we would like to do is just capture a free rook. But of course the queen would recapture it. So we want to make sure that the queen is forced to move. What I'm going to play is bishop to b5. It's check. And yeah, of course, black doesn't want to play this. That's this already a checkmate, by the way, because the queen is also pinned. So there's only one move. And we want to try and force this position where black recaptures, and then we can win the rook. Black can also try to be a little bit sneaky and capture with the king. But we can give a check, and in the end, the queen has to block, and then we can win the rook. The last thing we need to take a look at is Zugzwang, or in-between moves. This is probably the most high level, because this is the most difficult to find. Here we are trying to do a combination, and this can basically be any tactic that we have seen, but during the tactic we have to play a little bit more of a slow move, an in-between move, because continuing with the tactic immediately wouldn't be the right approach. So the first thing I would think in this position is, okay, I have a check, the enemy king has to move, and then I'm already thinking that maybe I can give this check. But the king is just gonna run away. And if you are too hasty and you play the rook to g7, you are gonna mess up your tactic. What we are gonna do here is play an in-between move. And we're actually just gonna play bishop to f3. This attacks the queen. And the queen has to move. There are not that many squares. For example, the queen moves here. And now we can play the bishop here, and suddenly we do have a checkmate because we are taking away the square. But this was not so easy to find because a move like bishop to f3 is a little bit of a slow move, and you might not be thinking about playing this during your games. This is the final example and probably one of the more difficult ones. What I would like to do here is to attack my enemy king with the queen, and then maybe I can win this queen. But if I go for this straight away, I also have problems. For example, here the rook can go to f8, I go here, then the rook can go to g8, everything is protected, this bishop is also participating. So yeah, the king has to go somewhere, and then suddenly white is promoting, and it's just a big mess, and white is gonna win. So I want to play this tactic, but I can't play it immediately, so I have to do an in-between move. And the in-between move here is pretty silly. We are just gonna play rook h7 check, basically giving away the rook. But now we can just capture the queen for free. So yeah, that's also fine. You might be thinking, well, why don't you just capture the queen for free in the beginning position? Well, of course, it's the same problem. A rook goes to f8. If we block, well, actually, they can make a new queen. So you can see that even though this position looks very tactical, very sharp, the solution itself is a bit silly. We just have to give away a rook, so we can block the connection between pieces. We also have an escaping square for the king, and in any case we are going to be able to capture the queen without running into some nasty checkmates.